On most clear nights in the city of Vancouver, a modest crowd of locals and tourists will gather around the storied 9 o'clock gun to witness its nightly firing. Like many of the monuments around BC's Lower Mainland, the cannon stands as an example of the province's colonial history. But the waters towards which this cannon points carry many different stories. They carry the stories of time immemorial, of indigenous nations who have stewarded these lands before the arrival of the ships of colonizers. They carry the stories of migrant communities arriving at the ports with varying aspirations, dreams, and experiences. They carry the stories of some of the most consequential moments in our many histories. In August 2017, the government of British Columbia, through a process of public consultation and nominations, recognized 15 places of historic significance to the South Asian community. Places like here, the location of the Khalsa Divan Society 2nd Avenue Gurdwara. Here, the Burrard Inlet where the Komagata Maru ship sought to dock in 1914. Here, the site of the execution of Bhai Meva Singh in 1915, and here, the current-day Khalsa Divan Society Gurdwara. While these places may not seem out of the ordinary upon first glance, these grounds and waters carry the complex weaving stories of rebellion, activism, community, and erasure. The sites of Burrard Inlet, 1866 West 2nd Avenue, Simcoe Park, and the Khalsa Divan Society Gurdwara hold the memory of significant events in the story of the South Asian community in the early 20th century. By 1906, as many as 5,000 South Asians had begun to call Canada their new home. Most of the migrants were of Punjabi Sikh background and found a home in Vancouver, the Fraser Valley, and in many cities across the province. Due to racist and misogynistic immigration regulations, all of the first migrants were men. Most found work in sawmills, agriculture, fisheries, and road and railway construction, working amongst other visible and marginalized migrant communities such as the Chinese and Japanese communities. In 1907, the newly arrived men established the Khalsa Divan Society to develop Sikh religious institutions, but it quickly involved itself in matters of general community welfare and became the focal point for the fight against blatant and continuous discrimination. In 1908, the predominantly Sikh community established the first built-for-purpose Gurdwara on 2nd Avenue in the Kitsilano neighborhood of Vancouver. For the next 60 years, this neighborhood would be not only the spiritual center of the community, but also political and social. Civil rights struggles and support for anti-colonial activism in India would all be fought from this Gurdwara. Despite being a Sikh place of worship, South Asians of all backgrounds found a home at the Gurdwara. On Sundays, spiritual practice would take place in the Gurdwara in the morning and evening, and the community would spend all day at the Gurdwara in between the two services. As decades went on and immigration regulations slowly loosened, the Gurdwara was where children would play while their parents socialized. Together, everyone would participate in seva and partake in langar in the community kitchen. Despite the thriving multiracial community in the Kitsilano neighborhood, the presence of non-white peoples was actively erased. Flipping through the telephone directories of the 1910s, the erasure of non-white peoples is seen to be quite literal and deliberate. In the place of names for any non-white residents are racial epithets. In yearly population counts, directory companies did not include non-white populations in their figures. In 1914, the Gurdwara and neighborhood found itself in the center of action between the Canadian Immigration Department and South Asian activists. In this year, the Gurdwara's leadership became deeply involved in the activism around the Komagata Maru and the Gadar movement, which called for rebellion against the British colonial power in India. The Komagata Maru story remains one of the most prominent and infamous in Canada's racial history. On May 23, 1914, the Komagata Maru steamship arrived in Burrard Inlet carrying 376 South Asian passengers. Led by activist Baba Gurdit Singh, the passengers were posing a direct challenge to the discriminatory immigration laws of the country. For 2 months, the ship would be held in Burrard Inlet. Canadian authorities would use all of their might to attempt to expel the passengers from the inlet. After a 2-month standoff, the stalemate was broken as the Canadian government finally provided some basic provisions for the ship to make the journey back to India. For the 2 months in which the Canadian government held the Komagata Maru in Vancouver's uncertain shores, the passengers faced extreme neglect. While South Asian activists formed a shore committee, which did indeed raise funds to support the passengers and launch a legal battle, the parameters for the Komagata Maru's legal case were such that the ship's passengers were set up to fail. In mid-July, a large group of Canadian authorities would even launch a covert attack upon the ship in the middle of the night, an attempt to drive out the ship by force. Still, the passengers, dedicated to their cause, used bricks, barrels, and coal to successfully fight off the officers. On July 23, 1914, after being ordered to provide provisions to the passengers, the Canadian government forcibly escorted the ship out of Burrard Inlet by the Sea Lion, a police tugboat. The story, however, did not end there for the passengers. Upon arriving in India in September, they were met by the force of the British Indian military, who had branded these passengers as revolutionaries fighting against the British occupation of India. As conflict broke out at the ports of Baj, officers opened fire on the passengers, killing several and arresting several others. Today, facing the Burrard Inlet in Harbour Green Park stands a monument dedicated to the Komagata Maru and its passengers. Modeled after the shape and elements of the ship itself, the monument features an image of the passengers, a list of their names, and a small description of the events surrounding the ship's expulsion. The Gurdwara's president, Bhai Bhag Singh, played a prominent role in representing the community at the time, and was one of 2 people to take on the financial responsibility of the ship's charter. Bhag Singh's activism made him the target of a conspiracy between Inspector William C. Hopkinson of the Canadian Immigration Department and his network of informants. On September 5, 1914, less than 2 months after the Komagata Maru's departure from Burrard Inlet, a man named Bela Singh Jain entered the 2nd Avenue Gurdwara during a funeral service and opened fire within the Gurdwara's walls. Bela Jain was a known informant of Inspector Hopkinson, and as a result of his shooting at the Gurdwara, President Bhag Singh was killed, along with 1 other man, and 7 others in the congregation were injured. Bela Jain was taken into custody following the shooting, while Bhag Singh, along with the other slain man, Badan Singh, came to be revered in the community's memory as shaheeds, martyrs, who were targeted by government informants because of their activist work. Today, the site of what used to be the 2nd Avenue Gurdwara is regularly visited by locals and tourists. While an apartment complex sits where the Gurdwara used to be before it was moved to its current South Vancouver location, a few plaques and markers denote the significance of the site and the neighborhood. Following the murder of Bhag Singh, Bela Jain's case was taken to court at the Vancouver Provincial Courthouse, now the Vancouver Art Gallery. Several witnesses who saw Bela storm the Gurdwara and open fire began to present testimony, much of it contradicting what eyewitness accounts had reported to local newspapers the day the shooting had occurred. One witness who was called to testify in this case was Meva Singh. Meva Singh, a devout Sikh man who was sympathetic to the activism of Bhag Singh, had witnessed Bela Jain assassinate the Gurdwara's president. In the days leading up to the day of his testimony in court, Meva Singh had been approached multiple times by Inspector Hopkinson and others from his band of informants, who were threatening him to testify that Bella was acting in self-defense and that was the only reason the shooting had occurred. Meva Singh, identifying that Inspector Hopkinson and his network of spies was the root of much of the community's trouble, resolved to take an action which would address the problem at its source. On October 21st, 1914, the day Meva Singh was to appear in court to testify in Bella Jan's trial, he entered the Vancouver Provincial Courthouse and assassinated Inspector Hopkinson from point-blank range. Immediately apprehended by the courthouse custodian, Meva Singh surrendered his weapons and allowed himself to be taken into police custody in the provincial jail in New Westminster. He was rushed to a murder trial within just a few days. In his trial, Meva Singh refused to allow his attorney to plead not guilty or call any witnesses. Instead, he presented a prepared statement which detailed all the grievances of the South Asian community, his personal duty to seek justice in response to the violence which took place in the Gurdwara, and implicated Hopkinson and his informants as the enforcers of violence and unrest in the community. Within 2 hours of his trial beginning, he was sentenced to death by the jury. On January 11, 1915, at 8 a.m., Meva Singh was executed in the New Westminster Provincial Jail. His body was taken by about 256 South Asians to the nearby BC Electric Railway Depot and prepared for his final rites. From there, his body was taken in a procession to Fraser Mills, where his funeral was performed. Today, the site of Meva Singh's hanging is no longer a jail, but a community park, within which sits a community garden. Fittingly, the name Meva itself means fruit in Punjabi. Revered as a martyr by Sikh and South Asian communities, the anniversary of Meva Singh's hanging is still commemorated today by Gurdwaras across the province, a testament to the activism of Sikh and South Asian communities over the decades. In 1969, as a result of a growing community and congregation, the Khalsa Diwan Society purchased land at 8000 Ross Street in South Vancouver and built a new Gurdwara, designed by the renowned architect Arthur Erickson. The move in 1969 was marked by a celebratory procession where the Guru Granth Sahib was taken in a decorated bus from the 2nd Avenue Gurdwara to the new Ross Street Gurdwara. For over 50 years, the Ross Street Gurdwara has continued to remind us of the community's ongoing soul and strength. It stands today as a testament to a community that has shown time and time again that solidarity lives.